Ronaldinho once was the most perfect embodiment of the beauty of football that the world has ever known. He wasn't just an outstanding player. He was a true artist who turned every match into a performance that left millions of spectators breathless. In 2002, he helped the Brazil national team win the World Cup, leaving his mark with that legendary free kick against the England team, a moment that has gone down in football history. In the FC Barcelona jersey, Ronaldinho reached the peak of his career by winning the Ballon d'Or in 2005, being named FIFA World Player of the Year twice, and leading Barcelona to the Champions League title in 2006, along with 2 La Liga titles. He was one of the rare few to receive a standing ovation from the Real Madrid fans, right at the Santiago Bernabeu, a tribute that transcended all rivalry boundaries. The titles, the awards, the goals, and the assists from Ronaldinho didn't just create a glorious career. They redefined how people perceive football, not just as victory, but as joy, as art, as the purest emotion. But behind all that glory was a journey filled with wounds that aren't easy to see. When he was just 8 years old, Ronaldinho lost his father, the first person who introduced him to the ball, and from that moment, his childhood ended in silence. He grew up in poverty, carrying the expectations of his family, his neighborhood, and an entire dream of changing their lives. When he stepped out into the world, his talent lifted him to the top. But it also brought pressure that few could understand, the pressure to always smile, always shine, always be the Ronaldinho the whole world adored. There were times when the spotlight became a burden, fame became an invisible cage, and he had to struggle not to lose himself. He stumbled. He was criticized. He fell into the darkest chapters of life. But what made Ronaldinho different wasn't that he never failed, it was that he never lost his smile. Because deep down, that wasn't just joy. It was the will of a boy who had lost everything, yet still chose to keep playing, keep living, and keep believing that light always exists, even on the darkest days. If this story makes you feel more behind Ronaldinho's smile, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a heart emoji to help spread this story. Porto Alegre, southern Brazil, a city not far from the sea, but carrying the heavy weight of poor working-class neighborhoods where dreams often begin in deprivation and grow up in silence. It was right here, in a modest little house nestled in a simple residential area, that Ronaldinho let out his first cry, not amid bright lights or grand expectations, but between old walls where every penny had to be carefully considered before spending. His family had nothing beyond love and a simple belief that life, no matter how hard, must go on. His father, João Moreira, was a shipyard worker, a man who labored with calloused hands and a heart always drawn to the ball. He played amateur football, not for fame, but because it was a rare joy after long days of work. On those tiring afternoons, as the sun set behind low rooftops, he would still head to the dirt field, bringing an old ball and passing on to his children a love that couldn't be named, the love for football. Ronaldinho's mother, Miguelina, was a nurse, a strong woman who worked long hours to keep the family from being swept away by life's harsh currents. She had no time for big dreams, but she had enough strength to nurture them in her children's hearts. In that house, where sighs sometimes rang out more than laughter, football became the only thing that brought light. It wasn't a choice, it was an escape. Ronaldinho grew up with a worn-out ball, on rough dirt pitches where every fall left scrapes, and with a dream so big that sometimes even he didn't fully understand where it would take him. Those afternoons in Porto Alegre had no stands, no floodlights, no cheering crowds. Just barefoot kids, one ball, and laughter echoing through the dust. But even in those simple moments, Ronaldinho stood out. He didn't just play the ball, he felt it, controlled it, as if the ball was part of his body. The adults in the neighborhood started to notice. They didn't say much, just watched quietly, as if witnessing something special. a rare spark amid a life full of limits. But for Ronaldinho's family, that talent wasn't an instant miracle. It was just a fragile hope, a possibility that might never become reality. Because behind every soft touch was a harsh reality. They were still poor. Meals were still simple. Bills still piled up, and a future with or without football remained uncertain. His father kept working, bringing home meager wages, while his mother tried to hold everything together. In that house, dreams weren't allowed to be too big, because the bigger they were, the easier they could shatter. But Ronaldinho, the boy with the ever-present smile, didn't know how to dream small. He took the ball everywhere. In the house, in the yard, on the streets, anywhere there was space, he played. Some days, football was joy. But other days, it became the only way to forget reality. Every dribble, every turn, wasn't just technique. It was a way to escape the feeling of deprivation, the quiet anxiety he couldn't yet name. And gradually, as time passed, those around him began to understand that for Ronaldinho, football wasn't just a game, it was the only path. But that path wasn't smooth. It was built on the fragility of a family always teetering on the edge of poverty, where one small mishap could bring everything crashing down. And it was in that fragility that Ronaldinho's dream grew, not as something certain, but as a faint, fragile, yet persistent ray of hope. No one in that house could know that the boy playing on the dirt field would one day make the whole world stop. They only knew one thing. If there was a way out of this life, Ronaldinho was probably that way. And sometimes that very thing was the greatest burden a child had to carry, even while still smiling. But not every dream gets time to grow peacefully. Some dreams are forced to mature too soon, and for Ronaldinho, that day came when he was only 8 years old. It was a day with no warning signs, a day that seemed like any other in the little house in Porto Alegre, until tragedy struck unexpectedly and changed everything. His father, Joel Moreira, the man who had brought the first ball into his life, suddenly passed away after a heart attack. No goodbye, no preparation, just a cold void appearing right in the middle of the family, as if someone had turned off the only light in the room. The house that day fell into a strange silence, not a silence because there was no sound, but because every sound had become meaningless. Ronaldinho stood there, too small to fully understand what death was, but old enough to feel that something irreplaceable had left forever. He saw his mother crying, not quiet tears, but the bursting pain of a woman who had just lost her life partner, the man who had shouldered an entire life full of hardship alongside her. The adults around spoke in low, hushed voices, while the boy, Ronaldinho, just stood there, clutching his ball tightly, as if it was the only thing left that hadn't changed. In that moment, his childhood ended. There was no clear boundary, no announcement, but everything had become different. The house no longer had the laughter it once did. The afternoons no longer had the figure of his father coming home after work, tired, but still trying to smile at his children. And most importantly, there was no one anymore standing on the sidelines of the dirt field to watch him play, nodding and quietly believing he could become something greater. From that day on, someone else had to step up. Ronaldinho's older brother, Roberto, was no longer just a brother. He became a second father, a protector, and a guide in his life. Roberto had also once been a promising player, but his dream gradually gave way to a bigger mission, keeping the family from falling apart and making sure Ronaldinho had the chance to continue the path their father had believed in. He didn't talk much about his own pain, but in the way he cared for his little brother, in the way he faced the world, you could clearly see one thing: he had sacrificed his own youth so Ronaldinho could hold on to his dream. And for Ronaldinho, from that day on, football was no longer just a game. It was no longer just the joy of a barefoot boy running on the dirt field, laughing with friends. It became something heavier, deeper, a responsibility. Every time he touched the ball, he wasn't just playing for himself. He played for his father, who was no longer there to witness it. He played for his mother, who was struggling to hold on against life. And he played for his brother, who had given up his own dreams so Ronaldinho's wouldn't be extinguished. There were still afternoons when Ronaldinho went to the field like before, still dribbling, still smiling, still astonishing those around him. But if you looked closer, you could see something had changed. That smile was no longer completely carefree. There was a touch of quietness in it, a touch of something deeper, as if the boy had begun to understand that life wasn't just happy moments. And it was that change that shaped the Ronaldinho who came later, a man who always brought joy to others but learned to hide his own pain. In that little house, once filled with the simple sounds of a poor but happy family, there now existed an emptiness that could never be filled. But it was from that very emptiness that something else began to form. Not a miracle, but willpower. The willpower of a boy who didn't want his family to keep living in deprivation. The willpower of a son who wanted to turn loss into motivation. And the willpower of someone, though still very small, who had begun to understand that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he still had to keep walking, because from the day his father died, Ronaldinho was no longer just a boy playing ball. He became hope. And sometimes, hope is the greatest burden a child has to carry. After his father's death, life didn't give Ronaldinho time to slow down. The pain didn't disappear. It just quietly stayed with him, slipping into every afternoon, every corner of the field, every breath. But if the little house held heavy silence, then out there on the streets of Porto Alegre was the only place he could breathe. And it was those very streets, not school or stadiums, that nurtured a genius. Ronaldinho began spending most of his time on street football pitches, rough patches of empty land, cracked concrete surfaces where every touch could burn his feet, where there were no fancy boots, no coaches, just instinct and the desire to survive. There, football wasn't a sport, it was a language. And Ronaldinho learned to speak that language in a way no one could teach. The games happened between poor neighborhoods with no clear rules, no referees, no spectators, just kids playing with everything they had, on the scorching concrete amid laughter, shouts, and inevitable collisions. Ronaldinho learned the first lesson. If he wanted to survive, he had to be different. He didn't have superior strength or an ideal physique, but he had something no one else did, a feeling for the ball. He touched it gently as if afraid to hurt it, then suddenly spun, getting past opponents with a move even he couldn't explain. The twists, the feints, the impulsive flicks, all of it seemed to come not from practice, but from somewhere deeper, where instinct met creativity. But the streets didn't just teach him how to play beautifully. They taught him how to endure. Every match was a small battle where mistakes were paid for immediately, where there was no room for weakness. He got fouled, pushed down, mocked if he played poorly, but he got back up, brushed off the dust, and kept going, because Ronaldinho understood something, even if he couldn't yet put it into words. If he wasn't strong enough to stand firm here, he would never escape this life. Football was no longer pure joy. It was the only way out. And every time he stepped onto the field was a step forward or a step back in the family's journey out of poverty. People in the neighborhood started to notice. At first, it was just fleeting glances. Then gradually they stopped longer. They stood at street corners, leaning against old walls, watching the boy with curly hair and that familiar smile control the ball as if it had a soul. Some shook their heads, not believing their eyes. Some laughed, as if witnessing something magical. And then the whispers began to spread, from house to house, from street to street. That boy doesn't play ball. He dances with it. That wasn't just praise. It was the first recognition, small but important, that Ronaldinho wasn't like the other kids. But even as his talent began to be noticed, reality didn't change. His family was still poor. His mother still had to work long hours. His brother still carried a heavy responsibility on his shoulders, and Ronaldinho, though still very young, began to feel clearly that every step he took on the field wasn't just for himself, but for all of them. There were evenings when he came home after playing, sitting quieter than usual. The ball lay next to him, but in his mind it wasn't just about the moves. It was about thoughts a child shouldn't have to carry. But the strange thing is that Ronaldinho never lost his smile. No matter how harsh life got, no matter how quietly the pressure weighed on his shoulders, he still smiled. Not because everything was okay, but perhaps because smiling was the only way he wouldn't be overwhelmed. And it was that very smile, combined with his natural talent and the harsh lessons from the streets, that created a very different Ronaldinho, a player who didn't just play to win, but played to feel, to liberate, to turn pain into something more beautiful. In those narrow streets, amid the dust and the noise of a life of poverty, a genius was formed, not in the light of perfection, but in the shadow of limitations. And perhaps that's why every time Ronaldinho touched the ball, people didn't just see technique. They saw a story about a boy who learned to turn hardship into art, pressure into inspiration, and poor streets into the first stage of a legend. The narrow streets of Porto Alegre could no longer contain Ronaldinho's talent. From the curious glances of neighbors, from the whispers spreading throughout the neighborhood, the name of the boy with the ball seemed to start breaking out beyond those dusty roads. And then, the inevitable happened. Ronaldinho was brought into the Grêmio Academy, one of the biggest football cradles in southern Brazil. For many kids, that was an opportunity. But for Ronaldinho, it was the first step of a burden he had never prepared to carry. Right from the very first days at the academy, everything became different. Here there were no longer free street games, no longer carefree laughter, but discipline, drills, fierce competition among young talents, all carrying dreams of changing their lives. But Ronaldinho, with everything the streets had taught him, not only fit in, he stood out, not with strength, not with speed, but with something harder to explain. A softness, an almost supernatural feel for the ball, an ability to turn ordinary situations into moments no one saw coming. Then one day, in a youth match, what later became legendary happened. Ronaldinho scored 23 goals in a single game. 23, a number almost unbelievable, even to those already familiar with his talent. The coaches stood speechless. The other players didn't understand what was happening, and those who witnessed it began retelling the story like something beyond the logic of football. From that moment, Ronaldinho was no longer just a promising talent. He became a phenomenon, a name spoken with astonishment, a chosen child. But it was from here that something else also began to form pressure. No one said it outright to him, but Ronaldinho could feel it in every look, every comment, every nod from the adults around him. He was no longer just a boy playing ball. He was hope, and hope, sometimes, is heavier than any other burden. Every time he stepped onto the field, Ronaldinho began to feel that he was no longer playing just for himself. He played for his mother, who kept working tirelessly, who always tried to keep the family standing after his father's death. He played for his brother Roberto, who had set his own dream aside to become his support. And he played for the whole neighborhood, the people who had watched him grow up, who believed he could be the only way out of their limited lives. There were training sessions where Ronaldinho still smiled, still pulled off moves that left everyone amazed. But inside, something had changed. He started thinking more, started understanding that every mistake wasn't just a bad touch, it was a step back in the family's dream. He wasn't allowed to fail, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't have the right to. And it was right here that Ronaldinho's second life began to form quietly. On the outside, he was still the boy with the radiant smile, still the genius who made everyone marvel. But on the inside, he began carrying a pressure few people noticed, the pressure to always be better, always different, always prove that what everyone believed was true. The pressure to turn talent into results, to turn dreams into reality. In those rare moments alone, when there was no cheering or watching eyes, Ronaldinho sometimes just sat quietly with the ball. Not to practice, but to think. He was still a child, but life no longer allowed him to live like one. He began to understand that the road ahead wouldn't just have beautiful moments. There would be challenges, failures, times when talent alone wasn't enough. But if there was one thing Ronaldinho never lost, it was the way he played football. No matter how great the pressure, no matter how heavy the expectations, every time he touched the ball, he still found something very personal of freedom no one could take away. Maybe that was how he saved himself, by turning every match into a dance, every touch into an artistic moment. He managed to keep some part of his true
Bienvenidos,
self,
gracias por
the
acompañarnos. Este
boy
es un
who
servicio
once
especial
played
de
on
TD
poor
con una
streets,
gran
not for
leyenda del fútbol.
fame, not for money, but just for joy. But even that joy began to change. It was no longer as pure as before. It became mixed with responsibility, with expectations, with an invisible fear that if he stopped, everything his family hoped for would stop too. And that was what made Ronaldinho a living paradox, a genius who played with a radiant smile, yet carried a burden few could understand. From a boy on a dirt field, Ronaldinho had now stepped into another world, a world where talent is celebrated but also constantly tested. And though he didn't yet know what awaited him ahead, one thing had become clear. From that moment on, Ronaldinho's life would never be simple again. Because becoming the chosen one isn't just an honor. Sometimes it's the start of a journey where every step comes at a cost. And then, when the streets of Porto Alegre were no longer wide enough to contain Ronaldinho's dream, when his name had begun to spread far beyond the neighborhood gossip, the first major turning point in his life arrived. In 2001, Ronaldinho left Brazil, left his family, left the dusty roads, left the only place he had ever called home to, joined Paris Saint-Germain FC. That wasn't just a contract, it was a farewell. A boy who had grown up in poverty was now stepping into a completely unfamiliar world, where the lights were brighter, where money was more abundant, and where everything seemed to operate by rules he had never been taught to understand. Paris was unlike anything Ronaldinho had ever known. There, football wasn't just a game or a way out of poverty. It was an industry, fame, something that could turn a person into an icon overnight. The wide boulevards, the luxury shops, the parties that stretched into the morning, all of it unfolded before Ronaldinho like a different world. A world where he no longer had to worry about money, where every door seemed to open if he kept playing the way he always had. But in that very openness, something else began to emerge, a void. On the pitch, Ronaldinho was still himself. Even more so, at PSG, he brought a kind of football Europe had never seen before: impromptu touches, mesmerizing dribbles, moments that made spectators stand up just to convince themselves what they had just witnessed was real. He didn't just play, he performed. And very quickly, the name Ronaldinho was no longer just that of a young talent from Brazil. He became a phenomenon, an artist, someone who brought joy to a football world that was growing increasingly pragmatic. But when the stadium lights went out, when the match ended and the fans left the stands, Ronaldinho stepped into another world, one he had never learned how to face. There were no coaches, no teammates, no cheering crowds, just freedom. A freedom that was too vast for a young man who had just escaped poverty. The parties, the new friends, the endless invitations, they all pulled him into a current that at first seemed harmless, even a well-deserved reward for everything he had been through. But gradually, that freedom began to turn into a challenge. It was in Paris that Ronaldinho's second life started to take shape more clearly than ever. There was the Ronaldinho the world saw, the artist on the pitch, the one who brought joy, who always smiled, who made football more beautiful. And there was another Ronaldinho, a Brazilian kid lost amid luxury, amid lights and temptations he had never prepared to confront. Those two people existed side by side, but they didn't always get along. There were nights when Ronaldinho laughed more than usual, but deep down he probably felt something wasn't right, not because he wasn't enjoying life, but because, for the first time, he was no longer in a world he understood. In Porto Alegre, he knew who he was, a boy with a ball and a dream. In Paris, he was a star but also a stranger in his own life. The pressure didn't disappear when he left Brazil. It just changed shape. It was no longer the pressure to escape poverty, but the pressure to maintain his level, to prove he wasn't just a fleeting phenomenon. And while he continued to shine on the field, off it, life started becoming more complicated. Small decisions grew more significant. Choices were no longer simple. And with each passing day, the gap between Ronaldinho's two lives seemed to widen. But what makes the story even more heartbreaking is this. No matter which world he was in, Ronaldinho still kept his smile. He still played like a child, still brought joy to the fans, still made everyone believe he was living the perfect life everyone dreamed of. And perhaps that very thing kept no one from truly realizing that behind that smile, a quiet struggle was taking place, a struggle between his real self and the image the world wanted him to become. Paris opened the door that led Ronaldinho to the world. But at the same time, it also opened the door to challenges he had never imagined. And from that moment, Ronaldinho's journey was no longer just the story of a talent rising from poverty. It became the story of a man who had to learn not to lose himself in a world always ready to sweep him away. In 2002, the world didn't just witness a football tournament. They witnessed a moment that would later be replayed as the definition of pure beauty in sport. And at the center of that moment, Ronaldinho stepped onto the planet's biggest stage alongside two other names, Ronaldo and Rivaldo. That trio wasn't just players. They were symbols of hope, of revival after the tough years of Brazilian football. But even among those stars, Ronaldinho carried something different, and spontaneity, a joy that no one could imitate. The match against England became a fateful turning point. Not because it was the toughest game, but because it was the moment the world truly saw Ronaldinho. When the ball was placed for what seemed like a harmless free kick, no one, not the defenders, not the goalkeeper, not the millions of viewers, could have guessed what was about to happen. Ronaldinho stepped back, looked up, and then delivered a shot that later became legendary. The ball soared high, cleared everything, then unexpectedly dropped behind the goalkeeper and nestled into the net. A brief moment of silence, and then the whole world erupted. That wasn't just a goal. It was a miracle. From that moment, Ronaldinho was no longer a young talent from PSG. He became a name everyone had to remember, someone that anyone who loved football could feel not just with reason, but with emotion. And as Brazil advanced step by step to the final, as they lifted the World Cup trophy in 2002, Ronaldinho wasn't just part of the winning team. He became the symbol of the joy that football could bring. The world loved him, not just for the skills, but for the way he played, the way he smiled, the way he made everything feel lighter, more beautiful. In a football world growing increasingly harsh, Ronaldinho was like a reminder that football, first and foremost, is a game, and he played it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But right from the moment the world fell in love with Ronaldinho, something else began to happen. His fame started to grow bigger than the man himself. Invitations came pouring in more frequently. The spotlight shone on him more intensely. The expectations grew heavier. He was no longer just Ronaldinho, the boy who once played ball on the poor streets. He became Ronaldinho, the one who brought joy to the entire planet. And when a person becomes an icon, they often lose part of their right to live like an ordinary human being. There were nights after matches, when the cheering had died down, when Ronaldinho probably sat alone, staring into space where no one could see, because while the world saw a smile that never faded, inside, He began to feel more clearly the pressure of having to keep that smile forever. No one asked him if he was tired. No one asked him if he wanted to stop. Because in their eyes, Ronaldinho wasn't someone who could be weak. He was joy. And joy, in the eyes of the world, wasn't allowed to disappear. The World Cup in 2002 lifted Ronaldinho to the first peak of his life, but at the same time, it placed him in a position where, from then on, every next step was watched, every mistake was magnified, and every moment of silence became harder. From that point, his life was no longer just the story of a poor boy becoming a legend. It became the story of a man who had to learn how to survive in the blinding light he himself had created. And in that light, the two lives of Ronaldinho began to drift further apart than ever one life that the whole world loved, and one life that no one truly understood. After the dazzling glow of the World Cup in 2002, the world believed Ronaldinho had found his path, a path leading straight to legend. But behind that glory, his journey had not yet reached its peak. And then, in 2003, a new chapter began when he joined FC Barcelona, a once great club that was sinking in crisis, directionless, and desperately craving a miracle. No one knew for sure if Ronaldinho was the answer. But after a short time, the answer became clearer than anything. He wasn't just the answer. He was the change the entire club had been waiting for. Barcelona, at that time, was no longer the icon it once was. They lacked confidence, lacked identity, and more importantly, lacked a soul. But Ronaldinho brought something no tactic could create: joy. Right from his first matches, he did what few could. He made football feel like an emotion again. His touches weren't just effective. They were so beautiful that people forgot the score. He dribbled as if dancing, passed as if painting, and every time he touched the ball, the crowd held its breath, waiting for the next miracle. Gradually, Barcelona changed, not just in results, but in the way they existed. From a disjointed team, they became a united collective, where every player was swept up in Ronaldinho's energy. He wasn't just a player. He was an inspiration. Those around him played better because of him. Matches that seemed difficult became lighter when he touched the ball. And little by little, Barcelona returned to its rightful place, not just as a strong team, but as a team that made the world fall in love. In 2005, Ronaldinho reached a peak every player dreams of. He won the Ballon d'Or. That wasn't just recognition of his talent, it was acknowledgement that he had changed the way people looked at football. He wasn't the top scorer, he wasn't the strongest, but he was the one who made football more alive than anyone else. And then, in 2006, he led Barcelona to conquer the Champions League, the title any legend needs to cement their place in history. But if there had to be one moment that defined Ronaldinho, perhaps it wasn't the titles. It was one night at the Santiago Bernabeu, the home of Real Madrid, where Barcelona's greatest rivals filled the stands. In that match, Ronaldinho didn't just play well, he left the whole world in awe. 2 goals, 2 dribbles that seemed to cut through time, leaving Real Madrid's defense helpless. And then something no one expected happened. The Real Madrid fans, those who were supposed to hate him the most, stood up and applauded. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't help it. They had just witnessed something that transcended all boundaries of rivalry, a pure beauty of football. At that moment, the world didn't just admire Ronaldinho. They loved him. In the eyes of millions, he wasn't just the best player. He was the happiest player who ever existed. A man who always smiled, always played as if there was no pressure, as if life was just a chain of beautiful moments, one after another. People looked at him and believed this was the life everyone dreamed of: doing what you love, being loved by the whole world, and never having to face sadness. But that very belief was one of the cruelest things the world imposed on Ronaldinho. Because the more he was seen as the symbol of joy, the less right he had to show anything else. No one wanted to see him sad. No one wanted to see him tired. No one wanted to see him as an ordinary person. And so, Ronaldinho kept smiling, on the field, off the field, in front of cameras, under the lights that smile became an inseparable part of who he was. But deep inside, the two lives of Ronaldinho were drifting further apart than ever. One life the world saw radiant, perfect, full of light, and another life quieter, more complicated, where pressure, fatigue, and choices began to accumulate. The evenings after victories were no longer just pure joy, the training days were no longer just excitement. And even though he still played with all his spontaneity, perhaps somewhere, a part of him had started to feel tired. Barcelona was Ronaldinho's peak. It was where he became a legend. It was where he gave the world moments that football would never forget. But right at that peak, something else began. The fragility of having to maintain perfection, and in a world that always demands more, that always wants to see you shine forever. Sometimes the peak itself is where a person begins to lose themselves, but the peak, no matter how brilliant, always comes with a price that not everyone sees. After the glorious years at FC Barcelona, when Ronaldinho had reached every height a player could dream of, the world began to look at him, not just as a person, but as an icon. He was no longer simply a football player. He became the face representing joy for the entire planet. Advertisements, interviews, international events followed one after another, taking him everywhere, from stadiums to unfamiliar cities, from stage lights to places where football was just a part of a bigger story about fame and image. And wherever he went, Ronaldinho had to appear with the same thing as smile. At first, that seemed not so hard. That smile was instinct, a natural part of who he was. But over time, as every moment was captured, every action analyzed, that smile began to become an obligation. The media didn't just want to see Ronaldinho play beautifully. They wanted to see him always happy. Fans didn't just love him for his talent. They loved the image of a man who was never sad, and gradually, an invisible standard was set. Ronaldinho had to always be the Ronaldinho the world wanted. That pressure didn't come from one specific place. It came from everywhere, from the newspapers, from the comments, from the expectant looks every time he stepped onto the field. Every match was no longer just a match. It was a performance. People didn't just wait for him to score. They waited for him to do something unimaginable. A move that made them stand up, a moment that made them feel like they were witnessing a miracle. And if one day he only played normally, that no longer seemed enough. The boy who once played ball on the poor streets, who once laughed with pure joy as the ball rolled under his feet, now had to carry on his shoulders a task no one ever stated out loud. Make the whole world happy, not just in 90 minutes, but in every moment he appeared. Not just with his skills, but with his very being. And that, though no one realized it, began to become a burden. There were days when Ronaldinho stepped onto the field with the same smile, but inside, perhaps he felt a little more tired, not because he no longer loved football, but because football was no longer as simple as before. It was no longer the place where he could escape the world. It became the place where the whole world poured onto him. The touches were still soft, the moves still spontaneous, but behind every moment was an invisible pressure to keep going, to be better, to never stop. And then Ronaldinho's second life began to become clearer than ever. One Ronaldinho the world saw, the one who always smiled, always brought joy, always lived as if nothing could hurt him. And another Ronaldinho, a man who began to feel the fatigue, the loneliness in the very light he had created. Those two people coexisted, but it became harder and harder to merge into one. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing wasn't the pressure, but the misunderstanding. The world looked at Ronaldinho and believed he was living the perfect life, but because of that belief, no one really asked if he was okay. No one thought that someone who always smiled could carry sadness inside. And so, Ronaldinho kept doing the only thing he knew: keep smiling. But a smile, no matter how beautiful, can't hide everything forever. Over time, small signs began to appear. Moments of lost focus, matches that were no longer as brilliant as before, criticism starting to creep into the reports. And, in a world accustomed to seeing him at the peak, any change became more noticeable, more harsh. Ronaldinho wasn't the first to face the pressure of fame, but perhaps what made his story special was the way he had been defined, not just as a player, but as joy. And when a person is defined by joy, they are often not allowed to show anything else. From a boy who played ball to forget reality, Ronaldinho now had to play ball to keep the world from forgetting the feeling he brought. And between those two things, there was a very large gap that with each passing day he had to cross on his own, in silence. Because sometimes bringing joy to the whole world isn't the most beautiful thing. Sometimes it's the heaviest burden a person has to carry. But even miracles can't last forever. And for Ronaldinho, the moment the world began to realize that came slowly, almost as if no one wanted to admit it. After the peak years at FC Barcelona, where he had once stunned the entire planet, the first signs of change began to appear, not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly, creeping into every match. The touches were no longer always perfect as before, the runs were no longer light like a dance, and the explosive moments, the things that once defined Ronaldinho, gradually became fewer and farther between. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Fans still waited. Every time he had the ball, they still hoped a miracle would happen. Because Ronaldinho wasn't like any other player. He wasn't just talent. He was an emotion. And an emotion, once deeply etched in people's hearts, is very hard to let go. But football, no matter how beautiful, is still a harsh reality. It doesn't wait. It doesn't wait. And when one person slows down, the world keeps moving forward. Right within Barcelona, something new began to form. A new generation, a new rhythm, and at the center of that change was Lionel Messi, a young, small boy, but carrying a different kind of light. If Ronaldinho was joy, spontaneity, free art, then Messi was precision, focus, a genius shaped in a different way. And gradually, not through words, but through what happened on the field, Barcelona began to transform. The heartbreaking thing wasn't that Ronaldinho lost his place. It was the way it happened, quietly, as if a chapter in the book was slowly closing without a clear goodbye. The matches where he was once the center were no longer the same. The gazes once fixed on him began to share with someone else. And in a football world always seeking the new, Ronaldinho, the one who was once everything, was now beginning to become the past. He left Barcelona, not in the dazzling glory like when he arrived, but with a hard-to-name sense of emptiness. There was no grand moment marking the end, no perfect farewell match, just a quiet truth. Time had begun to pass him by, and with it, a part of the magic slowly faded. The world, as usual, didn't wait. The comments started to change. No longer endless praise, but questions. What happened? Why wasn't he the same anymore? Had Ronaldinho lost himself, or was it simply impossible to hold on to the peak? And then, the phrase no one wanted to hear but everyone started thinking appeared. The magic was over. But for Ronaldinho, perhaps the truth wasn't that simple. The magic didn't vanish in a single moment. It didn't switch off like a light. It just gradually weakened, bit by bit, under the weight of time, of pressure, of the years he had lived, not one life, but two at the same time. One life the world saw radiant, perfect, flawless, and another life where fatigue, choices, and consequences began to pile up. Perhaps what made this moment the saddest wasn't that Ronaldinho was no longer the best player in the world. It was that the world began to forget why they loved him in the first place. They didn't love him because he always won. They loved him for the way he played, the way he made them feel like kids again. But in the search for new things, the world sometimes forgets the things that once moved them the deepest. And Ronaldinho, the man who once brought joy to the entire planet, now stood at a different crossroads where the light was no longer as bright, where the smile was still there, but carried something else. Not obvious sadness, but acceptance. Acceptance that everything, no matter how beautiful, has a day when it must change. But the real question isn't whether the magic has ended. It's this: when the light dims, what remains? And for Ronaldinho, the answer to that question would no longer be on the pitch, but in the rest of the life he still had to face. After leaving FC Barcelona, Ronaldinho's journey didn't end, but it began to enter another chapter, quieter, with less light, and perhaps more painful. He joined AC Milan, a tradition-rich European club, where people hoped he could find himself again. In the red and black jersey, Ronaldinho still had moments that made the crowd hold its breath, subtle touches, unseen passes, shots that recalled a time when he was the center of the football world. But all of that now appeared like faint glimmers in a sky that had started to darken. He was no longer the Ronaldinho of Barcelona, no longer the one who made the entire stadium stand up every time he had the ball. Instead, there was a different version, slower, less explosive, and seemingly carrying a fatigue no one had seen before. Fans still loved him, but that love was now mixed with regret. They no longer waited for miracles. They just hoped to see a glimpse of it again. After Milan, Ronaldinho returned to Brazil, wearing Flamengo's jersey, a decision carrying more emotional meaning than professional. It was a homecoming, an attempt to reclaim what once belonged to him, what once made him who he was. On Brazilian pitches, where everything felt closer, where football still carried the breath of the streets, Ronaldinho sometimes shone again. The familiar moves returned, the smile seemed more genuine. But time cannot be reversed. Those moments no longer lasted. They came and went like beautiful memories that couldn't be held on to. And then, in the Atletico Mineiro jersey, Ronaldinho perhaps had his last time making the world look back at him. He helped the team win the Copa Libertadores, delivering plays that recalled his peak, as if a part of the magic was still there, just not strong enough to light up the entire sky like before. Fans cheered, the press mentioned his name again, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to return to the Ronaldinho they once knew. But it was only a moment, because after all, an unavoidable truth gradually became clear. The light had weakened. Not because Ronaldinho no longer had talent, but because talent, no matter how great, cannot fight time, pressure, and the years that had taken too much of his energy. The runs were slower, the moves no longer as sharp as before, and the matches where he was no longer the center all of it painted a picture no one wanted to see but could not deny. And then, what every legend must face came to Ronaldinho: being forgotten. Not instantly forgotten, not completely disappearing, but a slow process where new names emerged, new talents took the attention, and the world gradually moved on to other stories. Ronaldinho, the one who once made the entire planet stop to watch, was no longer the center of conversation. There were days when people still mentioned him in old videos, in memories of a more beautiful era of football. But those mentions often carried a sadness, not because he had failed, but because he had once been so brilliant. And when someone has been at the absolute peak, any decline becomes clearer, more heartbreaking. Ronaldinho still smiled, even when the lights no longer shone on him as before, even when stadiums no longer called his name every week. He kept that smile. But now, that smile carried a different meaning. No longer the pure joy of a boy playing ball on the streets, but the acceptance of someone who had gone through the peak and understood that everything has an end. Perhaps what made this phase so tragic wasn't that Ronaldinho was no longer the best. It was that the world began to forget he was once the one who made them love football more deeply. And in that forgetting, a legend doesn't vanish, but slowly steps back, like a beautiful song people no longer hear every day, but still echoes somewhere in memory, reminding that there was once a time when football was magic, and Ronaldinho was the one who created it. But if there was one moment that truly made the whole world stop, not because of beautiful plays, but because of sheer shock, it was in 2020, when the name Ronaldinho, the man who once brought joy to millions, suddenly appeared in headlines for a reason no one could have imagined. He was arrested in Paraguay for using a fake passport. The news spread quickly, not as a football story, but as a shock. Those who grew up with Ronaldinho's smile couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could someone who once stood at the top of the world fall to a place like that? That image of football legend in prison became a painful symbol of change. No more stadium lights. No more cheering crowds. No more moments that made the whole world stand up. Just cold walls, iron doors, and a reality Ronaldinho probably never thought he would have to face. For many, that was the end. A sad conclusion to a story that had once been so beautiful it almost didn't feel real. But even in the deepest darkness, Ronaldinho was still Ronaldinho. And that, perhaps, was the most heartbreaking and also the most beautiful part of his story. In prison, where everything was taken away, where people are defined by their mistakes, Ronaldinho found the one thing no one could take from him, the ball. He started playing with those around him, not as a star, but as a friend. No audience, no cameras, no fame. Just people placed in the same circumstances, and a ball rolling on the narrow yard, and then something strange happened, as if history was repeating itself in a way no one could have expected. Ronaldinho organized matches in prison, not because he needed to prove anything, but because it was the only way he knew how to survive. Those matches had no trophies, no titles, but they carried a different meaning, a meaning closer to the boy who once played on the streets of Porto Alegre. Once again, Ronaldinho wasn't playing to win. He was playing to bring joy. The people in prison, people who also carried their own stories, their own mistakes, their own pain, began to see him not just as a legend, but as a human being. Someone who could smile, pass the ball, make them forget where they were, even if only for a few brief minutes. And in those moments, Ronaldinho became himself again. Not the Ronaldinho of Barcelona, not the Ronaldinho of the World Cup, but the Ronaldinho of the poor streets, where football was once the only way to forget reality. But what made this phase so tragic wasn't that he played ball in prison. It was the unavoidable contrast between past and present. From the world's biggest stadiums to a small yard in jail, from the applause of tens of thousands to the quiet laughter of a few dozen people. And between those two worlds, Ronaldinho remained one still, smiling, still playing, still bringing joy. Perhaps that's exactly what makes his story more complex than anything. Because if someone can bring light, even in the darkness, what does that say about that person? And at the same time, it raises a more heartbreaking question. Why did someone like that have to fall into this situation? The outside world kept talking, kept analyzing, kept searching for answers. But inside those cold walls, Ronaldinho was no longer a story. He was a person living, facing the consequences of his choices, and trying to reclaim a part of himself in a place no one wants to be. And then, when looking back at the entire journey from the poor boy in Porto Alegre to the peak of world football, to a cell in prison, people began to understand that Ronaldinho's story wasn't just about success or failure. It was the story of a man who lived two lives. And sometimes it was the second life, the one no one saw, that truly shaped who he was. In the darkness of prison, where everything seemed lost, Ronaldinho still held onto one thing: the ability to make others smile. And perhaps that's what not. The titles, not the goals, is the deepest part of his legacy. After those days in the darkness, when the prison doors finally opened, Ronaldinho stepped out no longer the person the world once knew. He was no longer the perfect icon of joy, no longer the genius who made everyone believe life could be as simple and beautiful as a single touch of the ball. Instead, he stepped out into a heavier reality, a name tied to scandal, to unanswered questions, to a fractured public image. The world no longer looked at him with pure admiration. They looked with curiosity, with skepticism, and sometimes with disappointment. The early days after his release weren't full liberation. It was another journey, a difficult one in a way Ronaldinho had never experienced before. No more pitches to prove himself. No more matches to erase mistakes. He had to face consequences that no dribble could help him overcome. Financial problems became clearer. Debts, disputes, the stories behind the lights that few had noticed before now became the focus. And with that came his image, the thing that was once the symbol of joy, now more fragile than ever. But perhaps the hardest part wasn't what the world said. It was how Ronaldinho had to look back at himself. For so many years, he had lived in two lives, one everyone saw, and one he kept hidden. And now, with all those layers stripped away, he was forced to confront his true self. The choices that brought him here. No audience, no applause, no lights, just silence, and the question no one else could answer for him. What comes next? And right in that silence, something else began to form. Not a miracle, but a change. Ronaldinho didn't return to the pitch like before. He couldn't, but he began finding other ways to reconnect with the world of football, with the thing that once defined who he was. He appeared at events, in friendly matches, in programs where people no longer saw him as a player, but as a symbol of a bygone era. Those steps weren't big, weren't loud, but they carried a different meaning. An effort to stand up again. Not to reclaim the peak, but to keep moving forward. He also started getting involved in charity work, returning to communities like the ones where he grew up. There, no one asked him about the scandal. No one cared about the mistakes. They just saw someone who had once been like them, a boy with a ball and a dream. And in those moments, Ronaldinho seemed to reclaim a part of himself. Not the Ronaldinho of the stage lights, but the Ronaldinho of the poor streets, where football was once the purest joy. But the road back was never easy. There were days when he still had to face criticism, looks that weren't the same as before. There were times when the past came back like a shadow, reminding him of what had happened. And perhaps the hardest part was accepting that he could never become the person the world once knew again. But maybe that was also the most important thing Ronaldinho learned. Not how to return to the peak, but how to keep living after leaving it. Not how to make the whole world love him again, but how to accept that that love, even if changed, still hadn't completely disappeared. Ronaldinho was no longer the player who made the whole world stop, but he was still a man who could make someone smile. Not with surreal moves, but with his own journey. A journey full of mistakes, full of ups and downs, but also full of effort to get back up. And perhaps in everything he went through, this was the hardest chapter. Not because he had to face the world, but because he had to learn how to face himself, a legend no longer standing at the peak, but still finding ways to live on one step at a time, slowly, in a world that was no longer the same, but still had enough light for him to keep walking. And then, as the noise gradually died down, as the world stopped seeing Ronaldinho as a scandal or a controversial story, something else became clear. His legacy had never disappeared. It wasn't in the titles, not in the numbers, but in the way he changed the emotions of an entire generation. Ronaldinho wasn't just a player who was once the best in the world. He was the one who made football more alive, more accessible, and more beautiful in the eyes of millions. Kids growing up in poor neighborhoods, not just in Brazil but around the world, looked at Ronaldinho and believed that football wasn't just for perfect people. It was for those who dared to create, dared to play their own way. Among them was Neymar, another boy from Brazil who grew up with Ronaldinho's videos, copying every move, every smile, every way he turned football into a dance. And Lionel Messi, the boy who once stood beside Ronaldinho at Barcelona, witnessing not just the talent, but the way he enjoyed every moment on the pitch. But Ronaldinho's influence didn't stop at big stars. It spread further to small pitches, dusty streets, places where football was still the purest joy. There were kids who never saw him play live, but still tried to recreate those dribbles, those flicks, those smiles they saw in old videos. And in those moments, Ronaldinho still lived, not as a legend of the past, but as an inspiration that continued to spread. Because Ronaldinho didn't just play football, he made people love football. He made them remember that football wasn't just about winning, wasn't just about titles. It was emotion. The joy when the ball rolled, the freedom when you forgot everything around you. In an era when football was becoming more tactical, calculated, and sometimes cold, Ronaldinho was a reminder that at the center of it all was still a simple game anyone could love. And perhaps what made his legacy so special wasn't that he once stood at the peak. It was the way he touched people's hearts. People might forget the goals, forget the titles, but they didn't forget the feeling of watching Ronaldinho play. They didn't forget the moments they laughed. They marveled. They felt like they were witnessing something beyond sport. Now, when Ronaldinho was no longer the center of the football world, when the lights had softened, what remained wasn't silence. It was memories, vivid memories, full of color, full of emotion. A man who once made the whole world smile, not with words, but with the way he touched the ball. And in a world that always changes, where legends come and go, Ronaldinho still existed in a very unique way. Not as a name in history, but as an emotion, a memory of a time when football wasn't just a game, but magic. And then, when all those previous chapters closed, the glories, the mistakes, the lights, and even the darkness, the final question still lingered. Who was Ronaldinho really? Not the player the world saw, not the legend written in books, but the man standing behind that smile. Ronaldinho was never a perfect player. He wasn't the most disciplined, not the most enduring, not the model that football academies tried to create. His career wasn't a straight upward line, but a journey full of twists, brilliant, but also fragile. But perhaps that's exactly what made him more real than any other legend, because Ronaldinho didn't represent perfection. He represented emotion. He was an artist of football, someone who didn't play to be the best in the conventional way, but played to turn every moment into something memorable. When he touched the ball, people didn't just see technique. They saw freedom. They saw a part of themselves, a part that once believed life could be simple, could be joyful, could be beautiful. But behind all of that, Ronaldinho's smile didn't always come from joy. Sometimes it was the way he hid the things the world couldn't see. The pain of a boy who lost his father too early. The pressure of someone carrying an entire family's dream. The exhaustion of a man who had to live two lives at once. And perhaps what makes his story so profound isn't how much he achieved, but how much he had to carry to achieve it. The world may remember Ronaldinho through titles. The World Cup, the Ballon d'Or, the Champions League. But those titles, no matter how great, still can't fully define who he was, because Ronaldinho didn't just win on the pitch. He won in the way he touched people's hearts, in the way he made a child anywhere in the world believe that football wasn't something out of reach, in the way he turned a simple game into an experience people would remember for a lifetime. And perhaps that's the truth behind that smile. It wasn't a sign of a perfect life. It was a sign of a man who had gone through every shade: joy, pain, glory, and failure, and still chose to hold on to one thing: the ability to make others smile. In a world that always measures success by titles and numbers, Ronaldinho was an exception. He wasn't just a player, he was an emotion, a memory, a reminder that football, before it became an industry, was once a game people played simply because they loved it. And perhaps that's the rarest thing a person can achieve. Some players win titles, some players break records. But Ronaldinho did something rarer. He reminded the world that football was meant to be joy. The story of Ronaldinho doesn't just inspire admiration. It also leaves a very deep sadness, a sadness born from the contrast between light and darkness in the same person. From the poor boy in Porto Alegre who lost his father at 8 years old, growing up in a fragile family, to the genius who scored 23 goals in a youth match, then became the one who made the whole world stand and applaud at the Bernabeu. That's a journey anyone would call legendary. But the very fact that he had to make the whole world happy after the World Cup in 2002, that he had to keep smiling even while carrying pressure and wounds inside, turned that smile into more of a mask than pure joy. Even more painful, the image of Ronaldinho in a Paraguay prison in 2020. A man who once stood at the peak falling to the bottom of society wasn't the collapse of a legend, but a reminder that no one is immune to mistakes and their consequences. Yet, the fact that he still played ball in prison, still brought laughter to people in the same circumstances, is precisely the detail that makes people feel heartbroken, but also the most respectful. Because that's his true nature, unchanged by fame or failure. For American society, a place that celebrates success but can easily forget the person behind it, this story is a clear lesson. Don't just admire the spotlight, but understand its cost. Don't judge people only by their peaks or failures, but by how they face both. Ronaldinho wasn't perfect, but that very imperfection makes him more human and also makes his legacy truer than any title. If Ronaldinho's story has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a heart emoji as a tribute to the man who made the whole world smile. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the beautiful yet turbulent stories behind the legends.